from by now, except if you're calling from Hawaii or somewhere else. So my name is Markus Keller. I'm a research viticulturist at Washington State University. I'm going to introduce a couple of people from my team that will talk with you about irrigation research that we have been doing over the last few years. So I'm going to go first. I'll present some results from our recent work, and then the next person to speak will be Dr. Charles Obiero. Charles is a postdoc in my team. He did his PhD in Australia and then came here to work on grapevine irrigation, water stress, drought stress, and heat stress work. And then last will be Dr. Geraldine de Veres. Geraldine is also a postdoc in my team. She just finished her PhD in December and worked on regulated deficit irrigation, partial root zone drying, and that's what she will be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm just going to go into these presentations, and then I'll hand over to Charles, and then from there we'll go to Geraldine. This is probably preaching to the choir with the audience here, but most of you likely know that in wine grape production, we're not after maximizing yield per se, we're maximizing quality, and the amount of water that we need to get the best quality tends to be lower than the amount of water we need to maximize yield. So when you look at the water stress spectrum in a vineyard or in a grapevine, you can go from totally overwatered with a dense canopy, high canopy density, lots of shoot growth, big berry growth as well, shading in fruit zone and so on, all the way to extremely stressed canopies where photosynthesis drops, you have low leaf to fruit ratio, leaves can be shed or the vines can even die in extreme cases, where at that extreme you get small berries, or the berries that are there can shrivel and you lose yield. Your optimum for wine grapes tends to be, regardless of where you stand politically, it's a little bit to the left of the center of the middle, right? So we want to have some water stress, but not too much stress. And that optimum location depends on your production goal. Where do you want to be? What kind of wine style do you want to produce, and so on. In order for us to get there, we have to monitor the stress in our vineyard. You can do different things. You can just look at shoot growth. You can look at plant water status using leaf water potential, stem water potential, sap flow, stomatal conductance, or you can measure soil moisture, soil tension, or something that I'll get back to you at the very end. Now also leaf reflectance is a possibility to study. When you look at when do wine grapes or juice grapes in this case, for those of you who are from California, juice grapes are similar in terms of yield and canopy growth to table grapes and raisin grapes. So they have a much bigger canopy. The canopy develops often earlier than in wine grapes, and it develops more quickly. But you can see that the amount of water that vines use depends on the size of the canopy. Wine grapes, which have a smaller canopy, tend to use much less water over the entire growing season than, say, juice or table grapes. Regardless of that, though, the majority of water use occurs during the warm and dry summer period between fruit set and veraison. That's when we have the longest days, when the canopy is typically fully developed or close to being fully developed. And so we can use about 50% or so of the water, up to 60% of the water for the entire season that vines use occurs during that time. And then water use goes down, the days get shorter, they get cooler, and water use drops towards harvest. And then after harvest, that water use can be quite variable. It depends on very much on whether you have late season rainfall or if you have to irrigate to get the root zone wet again for winter. So overall, vines use most of their water during the pre-veraison period when the days are long and warm. And that is also the time that you can conserve the most water. You have the biggest effect with your deficit irrigation that you will hear about from Geraldine later on. It's also the most sensitive stage in terms of effects of water stress. That is something that you'll hear from Charles about. What that means is that you cannot just, well, you can, but you shouldn't just irrigate at a set amount of water per week. Like, for example, here, 20 gallons per vine per week or something like that, because the water use, the water demand increases during the growing season and then decreases again. So you should follow the evapotranspiration. We're not going to go into details here, but the evapotranspiration is the amount of water that evaporates from the soil and from the canopy of both the grapevines and the cover crop, if you have one. And you multiply that baseline evapotranspiration that we use, ETO, that is usually calculated as grass-based evapotranspiration. You multiply that by a crop coefficient that is specific to your grape type and depends on the canopy size. So you can see that the crop coefficient, the KC, goes from 0 at bud break, there are no leaves on the plant, to about 0.8 at veraison in wine grapes, and about 1.1 soon after fruit set in juice grapes, and then stays relatively constant there until the leaves start to fall off and senesce. Your vine water status in your vineyard tends to max out. So vines that are fully irrigated are obviously not water stressed. You have some variation. In this case, what you're looking at in the top right is the stem water potential, so a pressure bomb measurement of the water status of the vine, of fully irrigated vines over in the top right. And then as the water stress intensifies, at some point, the vines start to feel the stress. But at about 0.4 or so, 0.5, depending on the grape type, of extractable soil water, so 40–50% of extractable soil water, that maxes out. So when you irrigate, replacing about 75–80% of the ET of the crop evapotranspiration, anything above that, you're not going to improve the water status of your vines. So you can waste a lot of irrigation water potentially by irrigating more at that high end of the vineyard. We're looking at stress, though, and in this case, and this is some new experiments that we have concluded recently in growth chambers, where we're looking at the interaction between water stress and temperature stress, or drought stress and heat stress. Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling in these high light intensity, high temperature growth chambers, fully controlled environment. We calculated, this is for the immediate pre-veraison period, more or less lag phase, calculated the 10-year average minimum maximum temperature, and in our case that was 57 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And we programmed our growth chambers. You can see the green line in the graph in the middle. I think you can see my mouse pointer here. The graph in the middle shows that green trace of temperature that follows a typical diurnal curve of temperature. And then we increased that by 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit to generate a heat stress over a period of 1 week. And we overlaid that with fully irrigated vines, all vines grown in pots in this case, or supplying just 50% of the water to create some kind of a drought stress. And then we measured a bunch of different things and looked at what was more important. Was it the heat stress or the drought stress? It turns out when you look at the physiology of the leaves, so gas exchange, which you can see up in the upper left side of the picture, stomatal conductance, photosynthesis, the big effect was water. So the leaves responded predominantly to the lack of water and not to heat, except when you combine the two stresses. So the most severe stress occurs when you have a heat stress interacting with a drought stress, which is something you probably know from your vineyard experience anyway. When we looked at shoot growth, it was entirely responsive to water stress. Less water means less growth, but no response to heat stress. And when we looked at fruit composition, and then we did some gene expression work and so on in the fruit, and anything we measured in the fruit was entirely dependent on temperature and not on water. So no effect of water stress, just heat stress effects, higher breaks, lower titratable acidity, lower malic acid, and higher pH in particular, with more heat leading into veraison. So water dominates the response of the leaves and the shoots, but temperature dominates the response of the fruit. And that's kind of important because in the vineyard, in a real world scenario, you always have a combination of those things acting together. When you do apply deficit irrigation, then you're obviously limiting canopy size, you're decreasing canopy density, and that tends to increase the canopy temperature. You can see the irrigated vines on the far left and the far right, and then the row in the middle, this is looking from north to south, is an unirrigated row. And you can definitely tell in this infrared picture that the canopy temperature increases with the non-irrigation. Charles will talk a lot more about this later in a few minutes. The fruit zone temperature increases even more when these clusters are exposed to sunlight. They tend to heat up by about 25 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient temperature. So sun-exposed berries are warm berries. And that is one of the main reasons that the effect of water deficit that we often talk about is really, I think, mostly an effect of temperature. By decreasing water supply, you're increasing not just the berry temperature, but also the canopy temperature, and that affects what happens in the leaves as well as in the fruit. So the question for us then became, in the recent heat wave years that we have had, what can you do to decrease the canopy temperature or the fruit zone temperature without actually compromising deficit irrigation? When you mitigate heat stress, you can use different approaches. You can either block the incoming solar radiation, or you can remove the radiation from the canopy. So you can use netting, for example. And by the way, all of these things are currently being done somewhere, not right now, but when it gets hot again, they're all currently being done in the industry in Washington and probably California as well. The problem with netting is it's not flexible. It can trap heat. It usually reduces light levels, so photosynthesis can go down, and it's very expensive. If you remove heat with overhead sprinklers or extra irrigation, even with drip irrigation, maybe you compromise deficit irrigation. Maybe you're just applying too much water and your advantage of deficit irrigation goes out the window. Or what happens to disease incidence? Are we increasing the disease incidence? Are we increasing shoot vigor? What happens to fruit quality? Can the berries split? They do sometimes, actually, even in dry climates when water is applied overhead. So we wanted to get around all of these problems. And there was another postdoc in my team, Ben-Min Zhang. He's now working in British Columbia as a research scientist for Agri-Food Canada. He developed what he called the MEX, the misting nozzles that are applied on a drip irrigation wire, as you can see here with my mouse pointer, either on a canopy wire, so a foliage wire, in this case on the west side of the canopy only, and pointing up and out, which you can see in the pictures to the right, or in a new installment that we tested over the last couple of years, applying these misters on the irrigation wire, on the irrigation line, just misting the fruit zone. What we're doing here is we're measuring canopy temperature using an infrared thermometer. So this infrared thermometer is placed in one row and then looks over sideways at the canopy of the next row, and then is programmed to control a solenoid that turns the water supply to these misters on and off depending on the canopy temperature. In this case, we programmed it so that it would turn on when the canopy temperature goes above 95 degrees, and you turn it back off again when it goes to 86 degrees or lower. And we also added a leaf wetness sensor that senses when there is too much water on the leaves, when the leaf water accumulates on the leaf surface, and that also turns the solenoid off so the misting stops. That means the misting goes in pulses, usually for a few seconds, 20 seconds, a minute or so, then turns back off again because the leaves are wet or because the canopy gets cool enough, and then comes back on again after a few minutes and so on during hot temperatures. So there's a feedback control that avoids excessive water supply on the canopy and on the soil as well. Our goal was to have no water hit the soil surface and all of the water just to evaporate up through the fruit zone to cool the fruit zone. I'm going to show you some results. To wrap it up, while I'm talking, you can look at this video by Ben Min, walking into this area where the misters are on. On the left, you can see initially the control where no misting occurs. And then you can see on the graph the canopy temperature without cooling during the heat wave in late July 2022 that reached a maximum of 116 degrees. Now you can see here the misting going. Now it's turned off. 116 degrees peak temperatures during that heat wave. And the misting device was very effective at cooling the canopy down by about 9 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. We were not quite able to reach that 95 degree threshold that we were aiming for, but overall the system was still very effective at cooling the canopy. And it did so with about 1 millimeters of water per day, so 0.003 acre feet if you must have these units, meaning that the cooling does not compromise deficit irrigation. Even though if you looked carefully at the video, you can see there is a little bit of water on the vineyard floor, and most of that is because he had to run the system long enough for him to be able to walk the road to take that video. So the goal ultimately is no water on the vineyard floor, all of the water just evaporating up through the canopy and cooling the fruit zone down. So then you're wondering, what effect does that actually have on what we're interested in, other than just cooling the canopy down? On the table, this is for the 2022 season. We ran this over 3 growing seasons, and the results were quite consistent. We had wine made at the WSU Wine Science Center by Jim Harbetson's team, and then analyzed both fruit and wine for components that we were interested in, as well as looking at yield and disease incidence and so on. You can see that the cooling increased yield markedly by 44% overall, and it did so by increasing the berry size. Remember, 2021 and 22 were very hot seasons. We had very small berries, and so berry size increased, and in the next year, the cluster number also increased. So it looks like the cooling of the fruiting zone also increased the bud fruitfulness for the following growing season, and we ended up having more clusters per vine. And together, those two components increased yield by 44%. At the same time, the cooling decreased the pH, increased the TH. That is something that we were wanting to achieve. It increased malic acid, and something we hadn't even considered, it increased yeast assimilable nitrogen, YAN, by almost 50%. In Washington, Eastern Washington, we typically have very low YAN levels. And so the cooling of the fruit zone alone was able to increase YAN to levels that are still not sufficient, but substantially higher. It also decreased at the same time wine tannins and polymeric pigments by about 20 to 25% or so. That is significant statistically, but because we have such high polymeric pigment and tannin amounts in Washington anyway, this is usually not a big concern in terms of winemaking. What cooling did not do is change shoot growth. We did not get more shoot growth with the cooling. We did not increase disease incidence. We did not get more powdery mildew. We didn't get any botrytis or any bunch rot on these clusters. We also didn't change the alcohol level. We had initially thought we would get lower bricks in the fruit, but that was not the case. So same alcohol in the wine and no methoxypyrazines. This was one of the biggest reservations that our industry had when we started this work, is we're going to get a lot of methoxypyrazines in the wine, and that was not the case at all. In most cases, this was even below the detection limit. So no increase there, very desirable consequences. And then to wrap it up before I turn it over to Charles, just an outlook into the future. We have been working with our precision viticulture group, engineering group over the last 2 years to see if we can remotely sense vine water status. And it turns out that if you use some kind of a shade on your cameras, so this is an ATV mounted hyperspectral or multispec camera that takes pictures of the canopy as the ATV drives down the road, it turns out that if you shade the canopy while you're taking the picture, you get much more even resolution and much more even response from your leaves in capturing that hyperspectral signature of water status. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is in the middle, measured leaf water potential versus estimated from hyperspectral images, and this looks really promising. You can even use this to estimate soil moisture. So measured soil moisture versus estimated soil moisture using a modeling approach, also very promising looking. And then on the left, lower left, you can see a mapping of not a vineyard in this case, but of a canopy. The water status mapped over the canopy. And this shows that there is not actual uniformity across the canopy. There's some irregularity depending on how shoots grow, higher or lower water status. And the ultimate goal that we're working towards right now with a new, what we call a smart vineyard, with a lot of artificial intelligence modeling being involved at this point, is trying to map vineyard water status on a spatial and temporal scale with the aim of fully automating deficit irrigation over time. And with that, I'm going to stop speaking and I'm going to get out of the screen sharing mode so that I can turn it over to Charles, and then we're going to take questions at the end. Charles, are you ready to go?
Yes. Can you be able to see my screen?
Yes, just maximize it.
Oh, okay. Something is happening.
Just click on the screen icon in the lower right. Yeah.
Do you see it?
Maybe click on it again.
Some reason I can. Is it there?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to talk about why irrigation is important in vineyards. And the picture that we are seeing here was taken from just a vineyard some miles away from the station here, and it's been a non-irrigated vineyard for a while. And what you see are the vines that are actually dying. For Eastern Washington, we cannot get any crop without irrigation. And so even with the less winter rains and early summer, this vineyard is just dead. What we are going to, just a little bit about what drought does to a vine is that the drought is experienced when the available water in the soil is held at a higher tension that the plant cannot be able to absorb. And the impact of that is that the plant leaves cannot be able to control what Markus has referred to, the gas exchanges, and therefore there is less whole plant sugar production, and you have more open canopy that your fruits get a sunburn. Sometimes they have berries that are shriveled, and you have overall result of poor fruit and wine quality. But like I mentioned before, in Eastern Washington, we have a problem. All our American viticulture areas are located in places that require irrigation. For instance, this is just the drought monitor, US drought monitor for Washington. And you can see my cursor here. Most of our vineyards are within the east. And this is a drought monitor for 2009, indicating the drought intensity. And this one is for 2021. And we can see that as years get advanced, we have more and more frequencies of extreme drought. And that's a huge problem. Water, and there are times when water to the vineyards can be shut off. And this, for a long time, has been a myth that people will just be not taking it more serious, because it has never come at a time when irrigation water may be turned off. And this is because most of our irrigation water comes from the rivers, but the rivers get their water from the snowpack. So whenever we have less snow and we have less winter rains, then there is not so much water that can be pumped out of the rivers to facilitate vineyard irrigation. This year, Rosa Irrigation District that supplies water to our vineyard is already on a 10-day water shutoff. And this is really bringing panic to most of the people using the water from this region. So some of the mitigation practices that people can employ in vineyards is like drip irrigation, which really is very efficient in conserving water. You can monitor plant water status through plant-based methods or technology or soil-based technologies. You can even employ cover cropping. You can have rootstock selection, adapted rootstocks, or drought resistant rootstocks. We can even have varieties that are genetically diverse or adapted cultivars that can be able to withstand some duration of drought stress. But what if that drought happens when you have already employed some of these techniques? There is understanding from the industry that the growers are normally advised that whenever there is some periods of drought, then they can be able to remove fruit. Now, our question is, does that really help the vines? On the top here, we have droughted vines of the Riesling with the fruit, and the bottom here, we have droughted vines with no fruit. And this photo, I took it in September in 2022. And so we just want to know whether vines without fruits can be able to survive drought better, and whether there is a difference within the varieties or when the timing of the drought occurs. For instance, does the drought before fruit set or during fruit set, does it differ compared to that comes at Verizon or later within the season? And how the variety differences in varieties can play a critical role in changing that understanding. Then we also wanted to know whether the drought and fruit removal have some carryover effect on the next next year's vine growth and productivity. So in 2022 and 2023, we set an experiment in our vineyard that was planted in 2010. And we have two varieties that are top commercial varieties in Washington and California, that is Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling. And we included three fruit removal treatments, where we had some vines that had none of the fruits removed. We had vines that had 50% of the fruits removed. And we had vines that all the fruits removed, to see the impact that is going to have in the following year's crop. And our treatments were drought from fruit set plus the fruit removal, drought from verizon plus fruit removal, and just our normal regulated deficit irrigation. And the vines were treated the same before bloom and after harvest. They received similar treatment in terms of fully getting full irrigation. So I'll present some of the results from my 2023 experiment. And what we see here is the plant water status through the pressure bomb. And on the left is the drought from fruit set, which I will call, maybe I'll use it interchangeably with early drought, and the drought from verizon, which I will use interchangeably with late drought. And this is on Cabernet Sauvignon. And as you can see from the graph here, the lines here, the ones that are dotted ones are the RDI, which are the control, and the full lines are the drought treatments. Then the green ones are the vines that we didn't remove any fruit. The red represents the vines that we removed only half of the fruit, and the green ones are the ones that we removed all the fruits. And as you can see is that where we had removed fruits, even if it is 50% or all the fruit, we had some of plants weren't as thirsty or as drought stressed as the ones that retained of the fruits. And the response was the same, even when the drought came later, that we applied for at verizon, when the fruit at 50% fruit color change on the fruit. In the Riesling, we also had the same response. And the graph on the right, on the left one is the drought from fruit set, that is early drought. The graph on the right side is the late drought, and same kind of response where you have the vines that we had removed some fruit, either half or all. They seem to cope well with the drought compared to the vines that experienced drought and had all the fruits on. So at least there is some understanding that yes, fruit removal can reduce the impact of drought on the vine. And just for your information, the table on top here is the minimum water status reached during that period of the drought and the fruit removed. And where we had removed all the fruits, at least the vines were not as stressed as where the fruits retained. In terms of the canopy, so here I have two treatments. The ones that are looking bluish, kind of blue, pinkish bluish, those ones are the control, where it's just our normal RDI, and where we have extreme yellow are the treatments that had gone through drought stress from fruit set. And their canopies were totally different. Either east or west, since our rows are running from south to north, either east or west of the canopy, the vines that had experienced drought from fruit set, their canopies were hotter, much hotter compared to the vines that were under RDI. And this is because they lacked the mechanism to self-regulate heat, where they can be able to get some water and to cool the canopy down. Whereas the vines that had some water from the RDI, they were able to kick in their cooling mechanism by evaporating more water, and therefore they get cooled. Then These vines, I will show you photos on the left is the Cabernet Sauvignon vine with the fruit on, and they're the ones that were undergoing drought from fruit set, the long or early drought, and then the ones on my right are the Riesling vines with the fruit on, or the same treatment drought from fruit set. The photos were taken on the same day, and what you see is there's increased leaf senescence and abscission, which is in turn impacting the crop, the functionality of the crop to perform, even transporting, making sugar and transporting it to the food. But if you look at the Riesling, most of the leaves, even from just where the fruit zone is up to the tip of the growing shoot, the leaves were getting senescing all over. Whereas when you look at the Cabernet Sauvignon, most of the senescing were happening within the fruit zone. So most of the old leaves were the ones that were getting chlorotic and dying off. So in terms of yield, we had an immense penalty on yield with the early drought. So we had about 60 to 75% yield loss, yield reduction in the varieties. And you can be able to see that in the graph on my left is for Cabernet Sauvignon, and on the right is Riesling. And here I have the RDI, and fruit zero means fruit, no fruit removed, 50% means half of the fruit removed. Then I have drought from fruit set, also the same level of fruit removal, and drought from Verizon. And what I want to say here is, even though the level of water status were the same, the yield reduction in the drought, the late drought treatments were not as intensive as those vines that had gone through a long early drought. So there could be something there that can put a smile on our faces, that if drought occurs later in this season, we can have some crop, harvest some crop for that particular season. Then we had smaller berries with early drought, but these smaller berries did not lose any quality in terms of Brix, in terms of TA and pH. So in the graph, on my left is the Cab, on my right is still the Riesling, and you can see the treatments that we have on terms of berry weight. The drought had even up to 0.5 grams of a berry compared to 1 gram in the control. When you look at the drought from Verizon, not so much of an impact on the berry weight. Then in 2023, I looked at the vines. How are the vines that were exposed to drought in 2022 performing in terms of the bloom, in terms of the flower? Are they having their bud fruitfulness impaired by the drought that had happened previously? And on the left is, I'm still having my Cabernet Sauvignon, and here we are talking about fruit caps per cluster. And on the right is the Riesling, also the fruit set per cluster. And yes, early drought really lowered the following years, bad fruitfulness. But where we had removed fruits, at least there was some improvement, not so much of an impact. And more so when we looked at the Riesling. So at least there are some results that potentially the varieties would respond differently, and the much impact might not be if the vine has all the fruit, it will be much hit by the drought. On something also that I looked at, the vines that had already experienced drought previously was the shoot growth. And this was measured before the bloom of 2023. And what I found in Cabernet Sauvignon is that the vines that had gone through the early drought were impaired in terms of their shoot growth. They had shorter shoots compared to the ones that never went through that drought. A little bit, not so sure if fruit removal helped there. Now, just to wrap it up for today, one of the lessons that I want to convey is that let's not panic. Even if for this season, most of our growers are going to experience water shutoff, and at different periods of the vine or fruit development, there could be something that we can harvest from this year. So, but one of the lessons that we learned from this experiment is that the drought from either fruit set or veraison lowers vines' water status alike. But the most dangerous one is the drought from fruit set is the most dangerous. Then fruit removal can really ameliorate vines' thirst, but it does not overcome the negative impacts of the droughts on the vine growth. Because even though we had lower water status, higher water status in the vines that had fruit removed, but they still had lower bud fruitfulness the following season and lower shoot development. Then another lesson is early drought negatively impact the following season's vines growth and productivity, but fruit removal may improve bud fruitfulness the following year in vines previously exposed to early drought. Nonetheless, all varieties impacted similarly by early or late drought and with or without fruit removal, except for some minor differences between the varieties. Moving forward, we need, as vineyard managers or people working with plants, we probably need to know our vines better, and we also need to know our soil. Bigger canopies demand more water. So now that people are panicking, the water is going to be shut off. Should I irrigate more and wait for later when water is available, then I apply more? But that is dangerous because you apply more water now, you obtain a huge canopy that will need more water to sustain throughout the growing season. And also, as Markus has mentioned, there is a threshold. Within this different soils might respond differently. But if we normalize our soil moisture to fill capacity and permanent wilting point, then we get the extractable soil water, the amount of water in the soil that the plant uses, the available plant water. And most of the varieties respond similarly to that. So if we know that extractable soil moisture at which our vines are going to get stressed, then we can be able to apply water much efficiently. Thank you. I will stop sharing, and then my colleague Geraldine will take over.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. I'm going to test.
Yeah, it's working.
If the screen is being shared.
Oh, yes, I can see it.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Charles. As you guys probably already know by this point, The area where we grow the most grapevines in Eastern Washington is located in a very low annual precipitation region. And viticulture in Eastern Washington could not be possible without irrigation. That poses challenges in particularly dry years, which, for example, 2024 is one of them, because on April 16th, there was a statewide emergency drought declaration that translated to water supply shortages in many regions. In fact, in my vineyard, we don't have irrigation water until presumably next Monday. So fingers crossed. And we have learned from Markus's previous experiment that the combination of warm temperatures and drought can be a very difficult cocktail to drink in the vineyard. And since I have been here in Washington State, it seems like we're trending towards drier and warmer years. Here in this graph, I have the cumulative growing degree days of 2019 all the way through 2023. And as you can see, all of them are above the long-term average. So those are news that are increasing the awareness in the adoption of water conservation strategies. So the good news is that irrigation management can help saving water while still achieving some of those production goals that we are interested in as vineyard managers. So the main or the most commonly adopted irrigation methods are regulated deficit irrigation, partial root zone drying, or something I have called conventional irrigation. Let's see particularly what each of these mean. So regulated deficit irrigation, which from now on I will refer to as RDI, supplies only partial water needs during specific growth stages. Partial root zone drying, which I will call PRD from now on, also supplies partial water needs, but the uniqueness of this method is that you will supply the water only to a portion of the root system. So you will be generating this alternating dry portions of the soil and wet portions of the soil through the season. And then this conventional irrigation that I have named full consists of supplying 100% of the water needs through the growing season, so you would aim to avoid water stress. However, what is that partial water supply? Like, how much are we going to stress the vines? When during the growing season are we going to do this? There are many, many questions, and there is a general lack of site-specific and variety-specific irrigation guidelines, and this is especially true for white wine grape varieties. So my team, or the team I am part of, designed an irrigation trial that aims to answer some of these questions. So here you have a little graph showing what we did and when we did it. So we have, let me get a pointer. We have here the growing season with some of the key phenological stages indicated. And we have here the 3 different irrigation methods that we applied. Now, the particular thing about this trial is that we wanted to irrigate according to soil moisture targets. This is why Charles emphasized the idea that you need to know your soil and know your vines, because the reason why we could design this experiment was based on preliminary data on our vineyard, and we knew what our permanent wilting point was, we knew what our field capacity was, and we also knew what soil moisture translated into our vines in a degree of water stress that was not, sorry, I should reword that. We knew what soil moisture translated into no water stress in our trial. So here you can see that the full irrigation had this 17% soil moisture target that again we chose based on the knowledge that we had on our field, and that was maintained through the entire growing season. RDI had, for the first part of the growing season, as well as PRD, the same moisture target as the full, because we wanted to avoid water stress before bloom and before fruit set, so we would not compromise yield afterwards. In the case of RDI, in that window between fruit set and verizon, it's when we imposed the deficit, and our soil moisture target was 11%, For PRD, we had a dry portion of the soil and a wet portion of the soil that we kept from fruit set all the way to harvest, and the targets are the same, 17 for the wet and 11 for the dry. And we would irrigate alternating. So that's what we did, that's when we did it, and this is how we did it. We had installed in the field access tubes, and we tracked the percentage of soil moisture through the growing season. And based on that data, we then scheduled irrigation. Now, the purpose of the trial was to gain more understanding on the effect of these different irrigation methods and what would the result be in terms of the grapevine physiology. We wanted to answer questions like, for example, is there a better irrigation method for white wine grapes specifically? And we chose Riesling to do this experiment. Can we save water while also maintaining yield? Can we make the wines better by using any of these irrigation methods? So that was the main purpose of this trial. But it also had other side tasks that I won't be covering today. But it's a very, very interesting trial. So now jumping into results from this experiment, we were able to quantify specifically the relative water savings of these irrigation methods compared to that full or conventional irrigation in which we try to avoid water stress through the entire growing season. And that is what you have in this graph. I have the 3 different years, and each bar within each year box corresponds to one of the different irrigation methods. And the red number shows the percentage of water that was saved by using this irrigation method through the entire growing season, accounting for the water that you need to irrigate before bud break, before fruit set, and also after harvest is done, when you need to refill the soil profile in order to get ready for the winter. All of those different periods are here with different colors. And the main result, or one of the great conclusions that we draw, was that both irrigation methods will save irrigation water. However, it is true that on average, RDI saved more irrigation water than PRD did. And also we realized about the fact that during fruit set to Verizon is when we consumed most of the irrigation water. Now, looking at this graph, you will notice that in 2021, we used a lot more water, like almost twice as much water as in 2020 and 2019. So in these little boxes, you have the cumulative growing degree days for that specific year, the evapotranspiration, and the seasonal precipitation. So as you can see, this trend aligns with years getting progressively warmer and also progressively drier. So in the next slide, I can tell you that 2021 required almost twice as much water, we saw it in the previous slide, just to maintain soil moisture within the desired range of soil moisture. And you can see that here. So warmer years demand more irrigation water. But this is something that you guys probably know and you have experienced in your vineyard. Now, the differences that we attained in the field through this manipulation of the irrigation translated into differences in the degree of water stress that the vines were feeling. So in this little box here, you have a classification of the degree of water stress. To measure water stress, we use something called a pressure bump that gives you the leaf water potential. So those weird numbers and those weird units correspond to these categories here that might be more intuitive and more easy to understand. And I have drawn these lines to indicate those different categories. So from this line below, no water stress. From this line to this one, it's mild. From this one to the following, it's moderate water stress. And from this red line on below, that's severe water stress. You do not want to cross that red line. And as you can see in the 3 years, we did pretty good job maintaining the degree of water stress in that mild to moderate. It's true that full maybe could have been a little bit lower. We wouldn't have wanted those vines to be lesser stressed, but at least they were statistically less stressed than the rest of the treatments. However, we could not find differences between the degree of water stress between RDI and PRD. And also something interesting and a result from this experiment is that overall, during this period that goes from fruit set to veraison, that it's critical, we were able to impose a seemingly small difference in the degree of water stress, but that sustained over time ended up having an impact in many things that we will continue to see in the rest of my results. Now, when we correlate together the extractable soil water content, that this is the little formula on how to calculate it. If you know your permanent wilting point and if you know your field capacity, you can easily convert that soil moisture content into the extractable soil water content, which is, so to speak, what amount of water is there available for the vines to take from the soil. And we saw in my irrigation trial that that trend that we also saw for Charles's experiment and Dr. Keller's experiment. And we were able to find almost at the same relative extractable soil water content that above that line, dashed line, the more you water, you're just wasting that water because the water status does not necessarily improve much with that increase in soil moisture. And that was a very, very interesting result because this was done with Riesling. Charles is using 30 different varieties that also show the same trend when pulled together, and Markus was using Concord, or his experiments were done in Concord. So we're seeing that this is something worth investigating more. So the conclusion from that is that more always is not always better. There's room for saving water and still optimize irrigation more. Another result from the experiment is that irrigation management affected yield. RDI was the treatment that saved the most water, but also caused the greatest decrease in the yield. And you can see that here in these bars that are below full and PRD in some instances. In this case, PRD was in between them. But conclusion, RDI can save you water, but it will also penalize slightly your yield. And the same was true for the canopy size. RDI was the treatment that reduced canopy size the most and increased the sun exposure of the fruit the most. PRD, on the other hand, kept the canopy growth at levels that were more similar to the control in terms of the shoot length and in terms of the pruning weights. The sun exposure with PRD was a little more intriguing, and we don't really know whether that was a protocol little mistake or just we didn't have replication enough. So that's something that we will continue to investigate. But clear conclusion from this data is that RDI will reduce your canopy and will expose your fruit more. So all of those differences that were attained through manipulating the irrigation ultimately translated into making the wines very distinct. I am giving here or acknowledging Danny Fox. She's a Wine Science Center student, and she helped me with that part. Wines were made from the fruit harvested in the trial, and the wines, when they were analyzed for the volatile compounds, meaning things that you can smell in your wine, showed that they were very, very different, and they all grouped together by irrigation treatment because we made 3 different independent wine batches from each of the irrigation treatments. And that's what you can see here in this graph. So for the 2019, all the PRD wines, the replicates 1, 2, and 3 are grouped together, and the same for the full, for the RDI, and the exact same trend was then consistent and repeated in 2021. So these results are beautiful. Thank you, Danny. And I also added here a little bit of the descriptors that will be associated with these volatile compounds. So you can see that these wines had predominantly compounds that gave them different characteristics. And sadly, or unfortunately, we didn't really perform a formal tasting with these, but these wines were tasted blindly in 2 different events with wine industry professionals, and all the people could not agree, or I guess the decision was equally split between the 3. So there was not a preferred wine or a better wine, but everybody could definitely tell that these wines were different. So I guess the conclusion from this part is that you can definitely alter the way your wines taste and the ways your wines smell through those modifications in your irrigation input. So almost to finish, I'm wrapping up here the lessons learned from this trial. 1, and very important, more water is not always better. There is this apparent soil moisture threshold, above which the more you water, not really the better you're making your vines feel. You're just wasting water at that point. Also, small differences or seemingly small differences in water status before veraison had an impact in the canopy growth, in the yield, and also in the aromatic composition of the resulting wines from that fruit. And from a more managerial point of view, if your priority is to save water, then RDI might be the best method for you. But if your priority is to maintain canopy growth, perhaps you could consider partial root zone drying. And then before leaving, I wanted to remind everybody that WSU Extension has very useful guides that are put together and that cover topics such as irrigation management under drought, and also many other things like cold damage assessment, cold hardiness, and many other useful resources. And with that, I'm done with my part, and I wanted to thank everybody.
Thank you, Geraldine. So if you will maybe go back to the share the screen. I know we had at least one question. Let's see. During what phenological stage was early drought? I think that's for Charles. Can you go back to the early drought?
The early drought was started at fruit set.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, Markus, love the idea of misters to cool the canopy. Do you have an estimate of costs that would it require to put in such a system?
I thought I had answered that question in the chat, but I don't yet have an estimated cost. I mean, obviously we have costs for all the components that we bought for the research, but I don't have a practical sense just yet about how much it'll cost, because that cost will depend very much on the level of sophistication, the level of automation that you want your system to be at. You can build many of these components. Ben Min, I call him the gadget kit. He built the infrared sensor in a Coke can, or I think it was a Pepsi can. I don't know who I should advertise for here. But he built all of these components basically by himself from scratch. So that makes it very cheap. If you are that tech savvy, you can do that, or you have somebody to do that. Otherwise, you have to buy them off the shelf, and that will make it a lot more expensive. We will be putting together a cost estimate here once we get to that point.
Okay. And Brian, your question was answered. I think Markus answered your question about berry size. So Charles, I have a question regarding on both your experiments, you were able to apply full irrigation at the end of the season, but
Yes.
in a drought year, often there's no more water left in the ditch to stretch you out that far. So can you guess what the impact would be if you weren't able to bring, fully charge up that soil profile again?
At the moment, we fully irrigate our vines after harvest to prepare them for the winter.
Right.
Because we suspect that if the roots are not well watered, then they might suffer from the winter damage. But over time, if there won't be enough moisture after the end of the drought, then the slide that my title slide will come true. The vines will just dry over time because there is no water to really rejuvenate them again. I don't know whether Markus has, because I think Markus is also putting things together to understand whether that water during winter, charging the soil during winter, it's going to be helpful to the vine. Markus, do you have something to say?
I can just confirm what you said, Charles, and that is one of the biggest problems that we potentially have during a drought year is the absence of water late in the season to kind of water the soil back in or fill the soil profile, whatever you want to call it. That is a critical step in Eastern Washington. It might be not quite so critical in parts of California, but I've seen this as a problem also in, for example, Argentina, where the rain does not come. They have the same amount. They have about 8 inches of rainfall per year, just like we do in Washington. But the rain falls in the summer, not in the winter. And so they often irrigate through the winter. That is a problem. Dry roots can be a problem. So if we have a drought year, we should do whatever we can to make sure we have some water available late in the season to water the vines back in, or they will potentially die in the winter.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. One last question here. I'm thinking about minimizing canopy size via RDI. How much do you think you can target your actual canopy size so you can minimize or avoid hedging? I believe Dr. Keller has talked about this before, and I know Thibault Scholash research also touches on this, but I'm curious how you think about irrigation amounts and targeted canopy sizes.
Oh, so I guess this question is for me. So from a practical standpoint, the way it has been done traditionally in our team, you withhold irrigation, and when the leaf water potential, the midday leaf water potential gets to approximately minus 1.0 megapascals or 10 bars in your pressure bomb, that is the point at which shoot length starts to slow down, and if you hold it for time, it will stop. So you can control your canopy growth and your maximal length by restricting irrigation water, but you do have to be careful on when this stress is happening. Like, it's better if it happens after fruit set, so you can plan your irrigation scheduling and try to predict. This is difficult because I always think as vineyard managers as hand readers or fortune tellers, because you're always irrigating based on what happened in the last week for the future. So yeah, it can be tricky, but I would say that you should aim for that 10 bars or minus 1.0 megapascals to slow down the growth.
It also depends on where you are. So it depends on where you're from asking the question, right? Because if you're in California, many Californian regions have sufficient winter and spring rainfall so that your decision is more one about when to start irrigation rather than to delay irrigation. In Washington, where we have so little rainfall, even in the winter, we can just stop irrigating. We have to often irrigate at bud break even to get the vines going, and then we can stop irrigating. And the first thing that will respond to water stress is shoot growth. Even if you're not measuring water potential in your leaves, shoot growth will stop at that about minus 1 megapascal that Geraldine was talking about, whether you measure it or not. So you can just watch the shoots growing. You stop irrigating until the shoots stop growing, and then you supply water again to keep the vines happy or keep them in that water stress level or soil moisture target level that you have aimed for.
Okay, great. This wraps up this WAVEx webinar. So as I mentioned, the recording will be shared with everybody who registered, And then we will post it up on our website. So thank you very much, Geraldine, Charles, and Marcus. And you can go get a few more things done today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.